All right. Well, right now, this little thing I'm doing right here, is kind of a placeholder because I've got a really exciting new sponsor that's starting up soon for a pretty short trial run, but I think you're going to dig them, and I just want you to get used to this idea that we might just be starting the show with a little ad, a little riff, if you will, before we dive into the teaser, say, like, right now.
I read a little too much Hemingway, a little too recently. A Movable Feast. Packed up my bags and I moved to Paris.
My. How goes it, CNFers? You know what time it is. This is the Creative Nonfiction Podcast, a show where I talk to badass people about the art and craft of telling true stories. I'm Brendan O'Mara. Hey, this is my podcast. Be sure you're subscribed to the weekly party. No RSVP needed. Wherever you get your podcasts, we're talking Apple, Spotify, Google, Pocket Casts. That's where I listen to my podcast, is on Pocket Casts. And keep the conversation going on social media at CNF Pod across them all. I'd love to hear from you. Tag me, and I'll give you those old digital fist bumps or whatever, and we'll just talk shop. That's what it's there for. It's horrible for promoting stuff, but it's great for engaging one-to-one. I'm happy to do it. This week's guest is Neal Bascomb, the author of Faster, How a Jewish Driver, an American Heiress, and a Legendary Car Beat Hitler's Best, Houghton Mifflin Harcourt. I feel like I'm a company shill for them, but they send me great books with amazing authors, so whatever. And you know something? No matter the week, I think come Thursday night when I'm packaging this MFA, when I'm recording my intros and, of course, my outros, it's time to celebrate, right? Getting this thing together is often no shorter than a miracle. It's like what Lorne Michaels says about SNL. We don't go on because it's perfect. We go on because it's 11:30. And then after the show, they're all kinds of happy. You know, it could have been a great show, but they got it done. It doesn't matter. I think even NFL teams, even if they win ugly, at least they won. And they celebrate that. It doesn't matter if they did it in style. They won, and that's a reason to break out the axe and shred. So I think I'm going to break out my version of the axe and shred. This frothy number, cheers, is RPM IPA from Boneyard Brewing out of Bend, Oregon. And why shouldn't we celebrate bringing another hot episode straight to your brain? In this episode, we talk about Neal's rigorous attention to research, how he uses Microsoft Excel to organize it all, the essay he wrote as a kid that gave him the juice he needed to pursue writing several failed novels, moving to Paris, and ultimately locking into the trip that is narrative nonfiction. You're going to dig this one, I guarantee. He was born in Denver, grew up in St. Louis, played a whole lot of hockey, loves the St. Louis Blues, and he is here to rock and roll. So let's hit it, CNFers, with a woo! St. Louis. So at what point, what kind of crew are you running with? Like, at what point are you starting to get sort of that maybe a literary bug, a literary virus, sort of inoculated in you?
I was a big reader growing up. I mean, I would spend hours reading, mostly the sort of fantasy fiction, Lord of the Rings, C.S. Lewis kind of genre, and just read all the time. In fact, my parents would often be like, get out of the door, go outside. So I was always a big reader. I remember, I was actually a big programmer, computer programmer growing up. Again, parents are like, get out of the house, get out of your room. So, I would do those sort of things. And in fact, the first thing I ever wrote that I tried to publish was a review of some fantasy computer game, bizarrely. This was, I must have been 10 years old, 11 years old, submitting this to a magazine, sort of hoping for a good answer, and received this sort of a polite, you're obviously a kid. Why are you sending me a review? Praising the writing nicely, but sort of like, not really. So I never really thought about being a writer or what that would be like until ninth grade, when I actually just posted this a while ago on my Facebook. And I had this great English teacher named Mrs. Barkley, and she had a writing assignment for us to write about a place that was special to us. And so I chose this valley that's about a couple hours outside of St. Louis. I had this core group of 4 or 5 guys. They had older brothers, and we would go out with the older brothers camping for long weekends. Just us. I mean, all of us in high school, and shoot guns and hunt and camp. 4 seasons a year, often in the snow, and we would go to this particular valley to fish, and it just was a really special place for me, particularly because it was freedom for me, and friendship and camaraderie. And so I wrote about that in this really, using every adverb I could find and really, flowering it up a lot. But I remember painstakingly, line by line writing and revising and wanting to create something that was really good. And, after I submitted to my Mrs. Barkley, she brought me after class and just was, praised it and said, this is really extraordinary, and I want to submit it to a national contest. And I, have you ever thought about being a writer? And that was kind of if there was a Chrysalis moment, that was probably it. So probably soon after that, and then I was reading more sort of literary fiction, of course, when you're in high school, and reading, got away from fantasy novels and reading other wide range of fiction. And I think soon after high school, I knew I wanted to be a writer. Although I thought I wanted to be a novelist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think a lot of people who write narrative nonfiction, I think at first, I think novels just hit us first, and we're like, oh, that's the thing I want to do, and then you kind of realize you're up against, or actually you just kind of maybe stumble upon some narrative nonfiction. You're like, oh, I can do this, and maybe work for a newspaper or maybe a magazine, and then it feels like you're getting paid to do this thing instead of going out on a lark hoping to get this novel published on spec or something. So I don't know, maybe it feels more tangible when you can pivot to the journalism and the narrative nonfiction, and it feels maybe more something like you can actually grasp, versus the novel seems kind of ethereal in a way.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I will say that sort of failure led me to, and I say this, I love what I do. I love writing narrative nonfiction, so that's the perfect thing for me. But failure led me there in many ways. Like, I really took the novelist ambition pretty seriously. When I remember graduating college, and, my father is a very practical person, sort of middle class upbringing he had, and so, it was all about getting a good, stable job, raising a family, living in St. Louis. And, he told me very clearly after I graduated college, like, it's great that you want to write, but you need to get a real job. And so, and now that I'm a father and I'm almost 50 years old, and I have children, like, I understand where he was coming from. That was said out of wanting me to have a stable life, which I understand, but it was crushing,
right,
at that age, right? I mean, absolutely crushing. And so I became a journalist, to your point, right out of college. During my summer of my junior year, I worked at a magazine in London called Euromoney Magazine. And at the end of that summer, they offered me a job once I graduated college. So as soon as I graduated college from Miami University in Ohio, I got on a plane and moved to London and was there writing, researching first and then writing. And then in Dublin, I did the same thing. And then I moved back. I moved to New York because I wanted to be a writer, and I thought that was the place to be. But I didn't know how to do it. And so I ended up deciding that my best move was to become a book editor and learn, how to be a writer, how to write books, be sort of immersed in that world. And so I became an editor at St. Martin's Press, or an editorial assistant, which is basically a secretary. And then, making my way up to editor over 4 years. But all through that time, the point is, as I meander, was that I was at night, I was writing novels. I was writing John le Carre like novels. I was writing Stephen King like horror novels. I was writing John Grisham legal thrillers. I was writing, all these genre novels that, I thought I had a great idea about the United Nations and the thriller set there, and then various other ones. And I would write every night at a coffee shop for a couple hours, and I was producing roughly a novel every year. And I would submit them, and I was in the business at that point, submit them to friends and who were editors or agents, and they just didn't work. They were terrible. So after about 4 years of doing, I think I wrote 3 or 4 novels over 4 years, I decided, you know what, I can't do this genre fiction. Like, I need to write the great American novel. So I packed up my bags. I read a little too much Hemingway, a little too recently, A Movable Feast. Packed up my bags and I moved to Paris. I didn't speak a lick of French, but I decided that I laugh about it thinking about it now, but that I had to live in Paris and write the great American novel. So I did that, and it was terrible. It was called Chasing Blue, and it was like most first sort of literary novels written by people. It was it was an autobiography in some senses. Yep. So it was bad. I didn't think it was bad. I thought it was great, of course. That's the thing you kind of need if you're a writer. You have to think your stuff is really good, or I don't think you could wake up in the morning. And submitted to people and friends who were editors and who I knew their stuff, and and they just thought it wasn't very good, and I was just crushed. And I was like, why can't I do this? Like, I feel like I'm a good writer. Like, I just can't get this right. And I moved back to New York, and so I'd failed as a novelist. Is the point. And then a friend of mine who was an agent, Scott Waxman, who's a very good agent in New York, and was a friend of mine, said, I have this story about these architects in New York, and in 1929, who were former partners and then became rivals, and they each ended up being assigned to design and build the tallest building in the world at the same time, which was the Chrysler Building and the Bank of Manhattan Building. And he's like, it's a true story. I know you want to write novels, but like, you should see if you could write this. And I put together a proposal, gave it to him, and it just worked. Like, whatever it is of my style of writing, my style of research, like, it sold right away. It sold well. It won awards, and everything I've done since has been very, I don't want to overstate it, but it's been easy. Like, this is
Mm-hmm.
what I should be writing.
I love the iterations of the fact that you wrote so many novels that, on the surface, yeah, they failed, but not every word was wasted because it got you to a point of proficiency and skill that when you locked into the thing that you were really supposed to do, it's like it seemed almost like the skids were greased in a sense, because you were able to lock into story. You had that practice. You put in the rigor, the hours after work when your eyes are already bleary from reading manuscripts all day. You still made the time to do your work. So you had this muscle built up, even though it didn't come to the fruition that you had hoped. But that said, when you were able to lock into this nonfiction story, it clicked. Like you said, it clicked.
Yeah, it was, in many respects, it was effortless, which writing fiction was not for me.
Yeah.
Not that writing nonfiction is in any way simple. Like, I still labor over it, just like I did that first story, The Valley. But I very seldom do I have to rewrite something, or in terms of struggling over how to construct a certain paragraph, or how to approach a individual character or person that I'm writing about, as I did in contrast to fiction.
Well, and I think a lot of that has to do with the immense detail you pay to research, and setting yourself up so the writing is, for lack of a better term, the writing is easy given how much heft you put behind it in terms of how you go about structure and research and putting it into an Excel spreadsheet. So maybe you can elaborate on that, just the sheer volume that you're doing to set up the writing and make the writing the fun, easy part, if you will.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of look at it, my work as a narrative nonfiction writer is like, it's really three jobs in one if you put it out, because you got to come out and publicize and be out there and market your books and talk about them. That's a part of the job. But the sort of two key essential parts of the job are, one, the research, and the other is the writing. And for me, the books generally take 2 to 3 years, depending on the particular project. And I would say 60% of that time is spent researching. 30% is probably writing, and 10% is rewriting. And that 60% is as you say, like, becoming so immersed into the particular world that I'm writing about. Let's take Faster as an example, my most recent book about Grand Prix racing in the 1930s. It was, I wasn't a car guy. I didn't know a lot about French race cars in the 1930s, nor the drivers. But you have to inhabit the world. You have to inhabit the language. You have to inhabit the characters. And so that is a process of hoovering up information, and just reading a ton. Like, there's just no way around it as far as I see. And, I love the research, and I could spend hours in a library reading, or an archive, or doing interviews, or going through material. I love that part every bit as much as the writing. And it's a very different part of the brain that you're exercising in doing that. It's detective work, it's collaboration, because I often work with research assistants, and because most of my books are set overseas, and so I have people on the ground that I'm working with and collaborating with. And it's just spending time, gathering up the details. What was the weather like? What was, in the case of Faster, what did these engines sound like? How did they feel in your hands when you were gripping the steering wheel? Like, what happens before a race starts? What are the movements? What's the orchestration of these races? What are the audiences doing? How do these race cars sort of move together through a circuit that threads itself through a tight city? What are the most dangerous parts? And that takes a lot of reading of contemporaneous coverage of the races or the race car drivers, but also takes walking the courses yourself and feeling the contour or seeing the contours of the streets, of the race courses. And that's all like super fun for me, because I know when I'm sitting down, when I'm done with the research and I'm I'm writing, like I need that detail and I need it at hand, because I don't want to have to do, because I'm in a different world at that point. I'm in the world of trying to write and trying to construct a narrative that's moving quickly. I can't divert my brain from that to, going to a library and looking for particular detail. I have to have it all there. So I never start writing until I have more than everything I need, like so much more. And I'm sure you've had other guests on here that say, I probably have 10 times the amount of material that I ever shoehorn into a book. And, that's the case. Like you never know exactly what you need until you're actually writing.
Yeah.
But for me, I feel like I viscerally need to know how everything sounds, smells, looks, taste may be taking it too far. But I need to have as much as possible. Coupled with that, just because of your question about the Excel, coupled with that is, and that I could totally, weird out on this kind of thing.
I love it. I love it when people weird out on their habits of how they go about it. It's just like Nomar Garcia-Parra, like tugging at his batting gloves, tapping his toes in the batter's box. It's like whatever you need to do to get into the right headspace to hit that ball or to write a book. Like I love it. I love all the weird stuff.
Yeah, so I was just having this sort of Twitter correspondence with Alexander Rose, whose newest, he wrote Washington Spies and Empires in the Skies, his new book, and it's really great. And we were weirding out over our research. I don't know how best to describe it, how we assemble our research and organize it. And so I do it through Excel. Like I will read a book. I will take notes on what's on a particular page, if it's a quote that I like or a source that I need to look up, or a particular explanation that I found very good. I will put that, if I read a 300-page book, I may have 30 to 50 lines in my Excel file about what's on a particular page. Same with an interview. If I'm interviewing, for instance, for Faster, like if I have interviews with Renee Dreyfuss, like what did he say on page 2 of the transcript about his race in Monaco when he first sort of leapt onto the scene? Like, similarly with archival material. So it's all put, all the, a year and a half of research, what I've found, what it says, what's particularly interesting, what's unique, what's original, what I found nowhere else, is all put into this massive Excel file that is probably, for Faster, I think it was something like 6,000 lines.
Wow.
of material, from everything from, a French newspaper. Like I went through French newspapers of the period. What was on particularly March 20th, 1938? What was in the French newspaper? What were the headlines? What did it say about Renee and this great race? And so all that's sort of packed together into this Excel file, and then it's and then I take that sort of raw material that I've collected that's interesting, and then I read through every one of those lines, and from that I construct the narrative, the outline of what's in each chapter, what's the flow between different characters, the timeline. For Faster, it's, where's Rudy Caracciola, the German driver? How much room does he have versus Renee Dreyfuss? Is it 2-1 that Renee's in 2 chapters for every one of Rudy? How do I thread them together, weave them together, so I'm not just reading about Rudy and then Renee sort of is lost? So it's a chapter by chapter and then a section by section within each chapter guide. And so by the time I'm ready to write, I know what's in chapter 12, section 1. And I've coded that into my Excel file. so that when I'm writing chapter 12, section 1, my Excel file will spit out, every archive, interview, book page, magazine article that is relevant to that section. And so for me, I read all that stuff and then I write the section. And then it's just doing it all the way through the book. And very rarely will I steer away from that.
That's incredible. When you're reading, let's say, like the memoirs of Renee Dreyfuss, and you're trying to process it in a way to make it fresh and new and faster, what becomes the challenge in reading some of that sort of primary source material, and to not make it just sound like you're merely regurgitating what they've already said? How do you balance that?
Yeah, I think you can, and when I read other narrative nonfiction, I kind of geek out on it too. I'm like, I will be reading sections and I'm like, where'd he get this? Or where'd she get this? And be like, okay, is she drawing it all from one book, or is he drawing it all from one book? Or is it this sort of range of sources? But because for me, like, for the most part, Faster, for instance, like, Renee wrote a very good memoir. It wasn't terribly exciting, but it had a lot of good information in it. It had, in fact, even dialogue that he recalled having. So, like, the material is really good, but how do I make that material read in a narrative nonfiction way? Meaning, how do I read it with kind of a novelist's eye? Mm-hmm. How do I present it? And so doing that, taking that sort of primary source material is really taking that sort of core, let's say it's a scene that I'll give it, it's probably better explained in a specific example. Renee won this competition in France in 1937 to be the fastest driver in France, which sort of catapulted him into a position where he could take on the Germans. So he recounts in his memoir that race, it's called the Million Franc Race, in 1937. In his memoir, it covers roughly 2.5 pages. Not terribly heavy on description. It's more like a couple things on what happened in this lap, what happened right before the race, some thoughts. But like, I painted that scene in Faster over the course of 20 pages, right? And so I knew I had this core primary source material, what Renee was thinking, feeling, but that's not anywhere near enough to put readers there and give them a real sense that they're involved in the scene. And so it is threading, to use the word again, it is threading that primary source material with the 6 accounts by French newspaper journalists who were on the scene and experiencing it from, an omniscient point of view. It's taking various other people who were there. It's taking video of the event, sound of the event, and bringing it all together in a way that you don't lose what Renee's feelings were, because he told you what he was feeling. But like, that's kind of not very dramatic unless you have the world around it.
Yeah.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, it's really just getting immersed in it, and it's kind of like, adding to that is you getting your boots on the ground there too. Like the writer Philip Gerard, who's a friend of mine and writes historical nonfiction as well. He when he was writing something for about the Civil War and the Battle of Gettysburg, like he started at the lower hill and like marched up the hill of Pickett's Charge, and like you don't realize how grueling that hill is until you actually walk up it, and then you picture cannon fire going off, rifles firing your way and having to duck behind rocks and all this, and then all of a sudden you're there and you can be with these men in this position. So it's great that, of course you read Renee's account, but I'm sure you also like walked or drove the course and you kind of had an idea of, oh, this is what it's like to be here.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, it's an immersion in the details. And I was thinking to someone the other night, it was like, how did you describe the language? Because at one point I write about, how the sounds of the engines sounds like, a bunch of wailing cats.
Yeah.
And like, how do you get there? And similar to your friend who wrote Civil War, it's like, it's by reading all these accounts. So if it's a war story, it's, reading diaries until, your eyes want to sort of pop out of your head. So that you're immersed in the language and the sort of cadence and the detail. And so that when you're writing, in some ways it's imitation. So, it's not, by no means is it plagiarism, but it's imitation. It's, it's sort of getting a feel of the language and how people describe things and at that particular moment and period of time and place, and then coming up with your own way of saying it that echoes the scene that as it was.
And when you were writing this book, I imagine it would have been awful tempting to thread in almost an obsessive or an excessive amount of Hitler's rise and the rise of Nazism, though it's a subtle backdrop of his rise to power and the symbolism of the Silver Arrow and what that really meant for the Third Reich. Did you wrestle with how much sort of Nazi seasoning to sprinkle through this? So ultimately the story had that villain, but it wasn't rooted solely in the rise of the Third Reich?
Yeah, and to that point, I'd say, I maybe make it the narrative structure sound sort of simple to do, but I think probably of any of my books, this one was probably the greatest struggle, just in terms of how much of this story is Hitler and the Nazi rise. How much do I need to go into Italian fascism? I mean, all these elements are important as context because nationalism infected the Grand Prix in the 30s, just like it did other sport, like the Olympics of 1936, just as it did sort of boys in the boat era, as well as the surrounding world. But like, I don't want this book to be a primer on the rise of nationalism.
Yeah.
Just another rework of it. And in the first draft, it was more of that. And I had to remind myself, or actually I had my editor remind me, not to underscore how important a good editor is, like, what's important for the reader to know in terms of the rise of nationalism as it relates to the context of the story that you're telling, not as a separate entity, right? You only want to tell the sort of rise of fascism and Hitler as it relates in faster to how it impacted the Grand Prix. And so I went away from, I remember cutting a lot of rise of fascism and going back and sort of bringing in how that related to Mercedes, how that related to Auto Union, the two major automobile manufacturers at the time who were being funded by the Third Reich. And so it's a good reminder, and even though I've written a bunch of books at this point, like, I constantly have to remind myself, what does the reader need to know? What's important for the reader to know, only as it relates to the story that you're telling, that propulses the story forward. Because I'm not writing doorstopper history. Like, doorstopper history has a place, an important place, but it's different than creative nonfiction. It's a different style of writing. You're conveying information differently, and I believe that sincerely.
Yeah, and it's something I loved too is just how, in the face of this, Hitler, basically tears up the Versailles Treaty, and people who might not be too well versed in World War One history might why was there this appeasement? And like you wrote of people driving through the French countryside and seeing like the scars of the trenches, and it's like World War One had just ended, barely 20 years before that, and that just the Somme, Verdun, everything was so fresh in people's memories that it's like the idea of another war just could not be fathomed. And so that's of course why people just let Germany kind of do its thing and just cross their fingers, really.
No, that's absolutely the case. I mean, I think it was willful ignorance or turning a blind eye or just believing what you want to believe. And, it's the people in the story of Faster who sort of step out of that. And in particular, I think Lucy Schell did that in a way that was important. Like she had her experience in World War One as a nurse in Paris that informed her view of Germany, the view of the horrors that could come from further aggression from Germany. And so that was so important to her motivation. And I was probably 90% of the way through the research when I found that she was a nurse in World War One.
Wow.
Right. I didn't know it. And then I was just doing another kind of dive into Lucy to try to get at her, because of all the people in this story, she was the most challenging to get at. And I remember doing this sort of research I knew she lived in Pennsylvania at a time. And so I did a bunch of local Pennsylvania newspaper research in from 1900 to 1925. And then I found this article about her experience as a nurse in World War One, her feelings towards the Germans. And that sort of like, boom, it opened up a world to me. And so, those elements of the research and the echoes of what happened in the past and how they inform a person in the story that you're telling are super important to connect.
Yeah, and you've said, I look for stories about people doing what we think is impossible, stories about ordinary people being put in extraordinary situations and coming through it. And the characters in this book, so many of them fit that mold so well. And maybe you can talk a little bit about, maybe we can start with Lucy, of course, and what an extraordinary character she was, a marathon racer, and then, of course, the primary bankroller of Delahaye and the 145 that would ultimately beat the Nazi car in Poe.
Yeah, so what was great about Lucy is, and I'm kind of embarrassed to even say this, but like I've written, I think this is my 9th book, and the majority of the stories that I've told are about men and their sort of experiences, whether it's spies or soldiers or runners. And I'd never had a woman at the central part of one of my stories. And so it was an absolute pleasure to have Lucy Schell as that role, because it was impossible not to write Lucy Schell well. Like, she just was an absolute dynamo. She was an American heiress. She was rich. She could have lived a sort of very comfortable, idle life, but she met this man who, Laurie Schell, loved racing, and she decided she wanted to try racing, and then just fell in love with racing itself, and ended up becoming one of the great American Monte Carlo rally drivers. And really getting at the heart of her was well, one, the nurse story, but also, again, and this is just a testament to sort of research of like going through these French newspapers day after day after day, because they're not indexed, and finding, I remember when I found it, I can remember that moment vividly. Like, I was going through this French newspaper called Intransigent, and in 1933 is this article where Lucy is meeting this journalist, and he's asking her if he can go sit in the backseat of her car as she does the Monte Carlo rally. And so over the course of probably 10 days of newspaper coverage, Jacques Marciac is there in the car with Lucy as she runs 9 days in the Monte Carlo rally. And you just get so much insight into who she was. And he was a great journalist and so wrote and had all these terrific lines. But one of his best was like, the icier things got, the more dangerous things became. Like Lucy Shell's smile just got bigger and bigger and bigger. And like, boom, you know who she is, right?
Yeah.
Right there. Like, you're like, okay, I understand this person. And just tremendous. And so she, when she decides that racing's not, she's going to hang up her overalls, she decides to start her own Grand Prix racing team. And take on, very David and Goliath story of, I'm going to take on the Germans because no one else is going to do it. And so she was the first woman to do that and own and run her own Grand Prix team. And yet we know nothing about her, right? I mean, she's classic one of these, the New York Times runs these profiles of amazing people who never got their sort of due and for obituaries. And I feel that way about Lucy. Like, she never got her due. And one of the pleasures in writing faster is that I, in some small way, hopefully, sort of put her place back in history.
Yeah, you're able to note that she didn't get her due even in her day. She was constantly overshadowed by, the men in her wing when she's like, no, like, this is my thing right here. This is my jam. Like, but everyone, the sexism of the day was just like, nah, she couldn't have done this.
Yeah, it's extraordinary to me in this day and age. I mean, I shouldn't say that, but it was particularly for her. She understood the role, right? Like, she played it in some ways. Like, she would be in her race overalls, and after a race, she would put her dress on and heels and take the glamour shots in front of her car. Like, she understood that was a role she had to play. As a female race car driver. And yet when she began to run her own team, it became too much. And I actually found in the strangest of places, at this automotive library in Florida, like this letter that she wrote these editors of all these French newspapers saying, I am the owner of Écurie Bleu. Like, this is my team. I fund it. I run it. And yet you are constantly saying that my husband, Lori, is the one in charge. Like, get your story straight, or I'm going to boycott you completely. And that was, I can imagine at the time, a very bold thing for her to do.
Yeah, and then, of course, I mean, there's Rudy, too, who was his deal with the devil essentially was driving for the Nazis and having the Silver Arrow as his car. But he was especially interesting, too, like, given, I mean, how rudely dangerous the sport was and how deadly it was. He walks away with a shattered leg, and then, something else horrible happens to him, and he's just in this grip of depression. And you note it so well by pulling out a passage from something he either said or wrote, that it was just like, you are the will that controls this creature of steel. You think for it. You're in tune with its rhythm. And goes on, I had to drive. There was nothing else for me.
Yes, and that came from one of his 3 autobiographies. And, if you listen to those lines, it was about power in some ways, and trying to reclaim his power, reclaim his sort of sense of like ownership in the world. And when he had the terrible accident in Monaco, and then he lost his wife in a tragic ski accident, like, there was nothing else in life for him but racing. And so he was this, you could paint him very easily as this, Nazi banner boy who, was the hero of the Reich. But it was a much more complicated tale. Like, he was not political. He was not, he didn't really subscribe to the Nazi ideology, but he wanted to reclaim the only thing he had left in his life, which was racing, and his standing there. And so he went and drove for the Third Reich, because they were the ones providing the fastest cars, and he was willing to be that poster boy, so he could drive, even if he didn't subscribe to the technology. And I think that corrupts him completely. I don't want to understate it, but it was a human decision. It wasn't a dastardly, evil character decision.
Yeah. Yeah. And I love, too, that I read somewhere that you said, I ask myself two questions before I start a book. And do I have something new to say about the story? And does the story have something important to say? And I think that's a wonderful starting point. And when you stumbled upon the Faster story, what was the answer to those questions, and how did that excite you as you started to delve into your research?
Every story is different. Like, some stories I know at the beginning, I'm like, this is the theme. Like, this is what I wanted to say. And like, this is an important book to write. Like Hunting Eichmann, my story about the capture of Adolf Eichmann in Argentina. Like, I knew before I knew that I could write, investigate it and like uncover new information. Like, I knew thematically, like, this was an important story about justice. Like, here was this great spy story, and yet it gave us the reason why justice is so important, why memory is part of that. And so that I knew from day one that was what I wanted to say. With Faster, it was a little different. Like, Faster, I sort of fell in love with the idea of the story, the idea of this car. The Delahaye 145, 4 were ever made. When the Germans invaded Paris, like, they sent people to find these cars and have them destroyed. They went to the Automobile Club of France and took all the records to erase this history. Like, the idea of that was fascinating to me, like, just on a pure narrative level. Like, what happened? What was it about these cars and their story that was so important? And that brings you to Renee Dreyfuss and Lucy Schell and everything. I didn't know for sure what the answer to those two sort of rubric questions that I always ask myself were at the beginning. I very quickly learned that really the story wasn't very well known, and that if I could uncover the research, that I would be telling a new story. And I think that's exactly what I did with Faster. Is like, this is a story that very, very few people have heard of. Most of the research is original and new. And so that answered the question very easily for me. What thematically it was saying, I didn't really know until I was in the midst of writing it. Like, for a long time, I just was like, I know, what is this story about? And it's really the story about what Lucy Schell did. It's like, we all can do, in the face of injustice or a corrupt regime or inequity or anything else, is like, we can't all be Martin Luther King. We can't all be great national leaders, but we all can sort of stand up in our respective worlds and make a difference. And like, that's what Lucy Schell did in her world of racing. She said, the Germans are just winning every weekend. It's making the Third Reich seem, indomitable, at least in racing. I'm in the racing world. I'm going to make a stand. I'm going to attempt to sort of knock them, at least symbolically, off their perch. And so thematically, that was what I sort of gripped onto. And like, that's the story that I tried to tell. And what's interesting, at least for Renee, the driver, is that he was apolitical, just like Rudy was. He didn't care, that he never really subscribed to his religion. He was, his father was Jewish faith, his mother was Catholic. He didn't assign it. He was a race car driver. Like, religion meant nothing to him. And so he kind of was the reluctant, quote unquote, Jewish hero in this story. And Lucy had to sort of bring him there and make him understand that sport had become national and had become symbolic, and that he needed to sort of step up to the plate.
And in the article that you wrote for LitHub that really dives into a lot of your research practices, I went below to read the 2 comments, and one was kind of a troll, but the other, I don't know if you read it, but one guy was just kind of a dick. But the other person was, it came from a place, it was kind of pouty in a way, but the kernel of the question is really. It's important, I think, and this is what he or she wrote. They wrote, what is his advice, I wonder, for those with a limited travel budget? Write about something down the block, or just set your narrative on Fantasy Island? Nonfiction is my favorite type of book to read. Writing one, though, is not so easy. I wish I could be that footloose. And so in any case, this person's just like, in order to write a great story, you must be able to travel around the world. But the fact is, there's a lot of backyard narratives, I think. So I don't know, maybe you could offer a little advice to this person that you don't necessarily have to be a globetrotter to find great stories.
Yeah, I mean, that is absolutely the case. I mean, my wife, and I've said this in a talk here or there, is like, my wife says that I choose my books based on where I want to travel next. And, I tend to like stories that have an international flavor to them. I find that they're a little bit untread more than American stories. But there are, I live presently in Philadelphia, and there are probably a dozen narrative nonfiction stories, whether historical or present, that I could go on to tomorrow. Like, there are stories everywhere. It doesn't require being footloose or spending, assistance or travel budgets or anything like that. I mean, you could tell a great story following the Philadelphia police department right now, and countering that with the resistance, Black Lives Matter movement right now. You could be on the ground covering that today, and it would make a tremendous story. You could be in the hospitals covering the COVID narrative of what the present doctors, nurses, and even medical students, like, who were sort of pushed to the front lines of this pandemic. Like, what's their story? Like, that's right out of my door. I could walk 3 blocks and do that story. So I think, I think it's really about opening your eyes and being open to different stories, and you can find it anywhere.
And granted, like, Laura Hillenbrand has a pretty severe sort of medical condition, but she wrote 2 of the greatest books of the 21st century basically from her house. She couldn't go anywhere or travel. She just did it from archival research and phone interviews, and look at what she was able to do with Seabiscuit and Unbroken. So, you don't need to be globetrotting.
No, you do not need to be globetrotting. And Laura, is of anyone doing this kind of nonfiction, I mean, she's the hero, right? I mean,
she's incredible. Yep.
She's incredible. And the diligence of her research, and the way she goes about it, and the way she even, the amount of time it takes her to go through material is just incredible. And there are so many resources. I remember when I started Higher, my first book back in 2000, like, it was just a very different research than it is today. Like, there's just so much available, digitized, that there's really, a wealth of material out there.
What would you say is, like, maybe where you feel the most alive and most engaged in the entire book process?
It's a very good question. I haven't thought of that. I would say the first, usually the prologue, or whether the first chapter, like, I write it and I finish it, and then, like, it's really the moment that I'm kind of most excited about the writing, and like, oh my, this is an incredible story, and I'm gonna kill it, and like, you have to read this. And so it's the only, I I don't intentionally do this, but like whenever I finish that prologue or the first 3,000 words, I'm always like sending it to my agent and sending it to my editor. I'm like, here it comes, this book is going to be amazing. I let my wife read it, and I'm like, I'm a genius, and this is fantastic. I've picked the best job in the world. And then usually they write back and say, oh, it's very good, and basically say, and then it's back to the job, right? And then it's like, oh my God, I got 98,000 more words to write over the next 6 months to a year. I'm going to become this miserable hermit of a person. I'm not going to call my parents. I'm going to neglect my wife and my children. They're going to be mad at me. My agent's going to be asking where it is, and my editor is going to be saying, are you going to hit deadline? But that prologue is regardless of whether it's crap or it's good, for me it's gold. Like I've sort of hit the moment.
It's kind of like the shape of a hammock between two trees. Like right at the start, you're all kinds of high, and then it just goes downhill. Then it's just a sagging slog of the middle, and it's just you're hanging there. But eventually, you go back up. You're like, yes, I can see the end, and there you are again, back on a high after going through that ugly middle.
Yeah, no, I think that's a very good analogy. It's that moment in the beginning is a very sweet one. I don't think I don't know if I'm most alive in that moment, but it's the sweetest moment of each book.
Well, awesome. Well, Neal, the Faster was such a fun, gripping read, so informative, and just I really just fell in love with all those characters, and that's a testament to the research and the work you were able to do to bring these people to life, nearly 100 years ago, 80 years ago or so, 90, that they feel alive, and and I knew I just grew to like them and care about them so much. So, thank you so much for the work, and where can people get a little more familiar with you and your work, and of course find the book and buy the book.
Absolutely. So, and by the way, this was super fun to talk about, and I love the questions. Like I haven't talked about some of this stuff in a very long time, so that's I'm glad you brought this stuff up. So they can find my stuff www, if I need to say that, nealbascomb.com.
http://
they can search Neal Bascomb, NealBascomb.com, and my books are there, and you can find me my social media from there, and newsletters and that kind of thing. And I hope your listeners give Faster and some of my other books a shot.
Yeah, and they sign up for your newsletter, too, because you give away signed book plates, which is really, really cool.
Yeah, I'm doing that. I'm trying something different. You're always trying, different things. And I have these very cool book plates for Faster that I put together. So, I'm happy to send them to people.
Fantastic. Well, of course. Thank you so much for hopping on the show, Neal, and best of luck with the book. And we'll have to do this again. Hopefully not in the not too distant future.
That'd be great. I'd love to come back.
My goodness, that was a fun jam. I thought so. Thanks to Neal for coming on the show. What a trip. Love that guy. Faster is the name of the book. Great book. Go get it. I feel like there's a lot of books around sort of diving into Nazi times. There was Christina Gaddy's book, Flowers in the Gutter, earlier this year. I have a few others on the shelf I haven't even touched yet. It's really rich. You have a baked-in universal villain. Sometimes that's hard to find in nonfiction. And when you can lock into a villain, well, shit, the fucking Nazis. Don't get much more villainous than that. Be sure you're subscribed to the monthly newsletter where I send out reading recs and what you might have missed from the world of the podcast. For subscribers, I raffle off copies of books I receive. As long as you remain subscribed, you're always eligible. First of the month, no spam. Can't beat it. And here we are. We've done it. Even after 206 of these jams, one thing rings true. If you can do, interview. See ya!